Today, I wanted to talk about a relationship dynamic that gets a lot of attention online, which is the anxious and the avoidant pairing. If you have spent any time consuming attachment content, you've probably heard things like anxious and avoidant relationships never work. It's the most toxic pairing, run, right? You're incompatible. And while I understand where those statements come from, I think they're often too simplistic. Because what if the problem isn't anxious attachment? And what if the problem isn't avoidant attachment? What if the real issue is two people who are unaware of their patterns and unwilling to work through them, right? Recently, I shared a post saying, contrary to popular belief, the path of least resistance isn't always the best choice. Because the reality is, we all bring wounds and fears and attachment patterns into relationships. We're human. And what matters most is whether two people can recognize them and work through them together, right? To me, that is the purest form of relational healing. And that's exactly what I want to talk about today, because I think we're living in a culture that has become obsessed with convenience. Everything is faster than ever, right? Food arrives in minutes, movies stream instantly. We can order almost anything with a click of a button. Dating apps, give us access to hundreds, sometimes thousands of potential partners. And while convenience has made many aspects of life easier, I think it's also influenced how people approach relationships. Many people have unknowingly started treating relationships like products. If it becomes difficult, replace it. If conflict arises, well, then leave. If someone disappoints you, well, then move on. If you're triggered, well, then just assume they're wrong for you. But relationships don't work like products, right? Relationships don't work like accessories. You're not dealing with an app. You're not dealing with a subscription. You're dealing with a living, breathing human being, right? A human being with a personality, a history, a family, a nervous system, a unique set of strengths, a unique set of fears, a unique set of wounds. And the reality is, so are they with you. So that's why relationships are so beautiful. And it's also why relationships are so challenging. And I think one of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming that challenge automatically means incompatibility. And it doesn't. Challenge simply means you're interacting with another human being. Now, let's be clear. I'm not talking about unhealthy relationships here. There is a difference between unhealthy and challenging, right? An unhealthy relationship may involve manipulation, abuse, chronic disrespect, emotional neglect, dishonesty, control, or just a complete unwillingness to take responsibility, right? And those are serious concerns. These are not things we should excuse in the name of attachment theory. But challenging is different. Challenging may mean learning how to communicate with someone whose style is different than yours, learning how to navigate conflict, right? Challenging can be learning how to express your needs when you don't know how, learning how to hear feedback, learning how to trust, learning how to repair after misunderstandings, learning how to tolerate vulnerability. These experiences can be super uncomfortable. But uncomfortable is not the same thing as unhealthy. And this is where attachment styles becomes incredibly important because many of us are not seeing our relationships clearly. We're seeing them through the lens of our attachment wounds. An anxious person may interpret distance as rejection. An avoidant person may interpret closeness as pressure. A fearful avoidant may interpret both closeness and distance as threatening. And the challenge isn't always what's happening, right? The challenge is often the story we're telling ourselves about what's happening. So for someone with anxious attachment, a delayed text message can trigger fears of abandonment, right? A partner needing space can feel like evidence that they're pulling away. And the nervous system reacts as though the relationship is actually in danger. For someone with avoidant attachment, on the other hand, vulnerability can feel overwhelming, right? A partner asking for emotional connection can feel suffocating. And the nervous system reacts as though independence is being threatened. For someone with a fearful avoidant attachment, there is often this painful push-pull dynamic, right? They want love, they crave connection, but they also fear being hurt. They move towards intimacy and away from it at the same time. And there tends to be a lot of inner turmoil and back and forth happening inside of them. So this is why self-awareness matters so, so much, because attachment styles don't doom relationships. Unawareness does. Avoidance of growth does. Refusal to take accountability does. Lack of communication does. An anxious person who understands their triggers can learn to self-soothe rather than demand constant reassurance. An avoidant person who understands their patterns can learn to communicate their needs rather than just withdraw. And a fearful avoidant can learn to tolerate closeness without running from it. The goal isn't perfection here. The goal is awareness and, most importantly, a willingness. The internet often frames relationships as, find someone who never triggers you. But that's not realistic. Any meaningful relationship will eventually activate something inside of you. Not because it's wrong, but because intimacy has a way of revealing our unresolved wounds. And honestly, you guys, it's not surprising that the anxious-avoidant dynamic is one of the most common relationship pairings. In fact, if we zoom out, most relationships involve some degree of polarity, right? One person tends to lean a little bit more towards connection, while the other tends to lean a little bit more towards autonomy. One tends to pursue a bit more, while the other tends to need a little bit more space. And that doesn't automatically mean, either person is insecure. It's just part of being human. Even in secure relationships, we see that. So throughout nature and creation, we see balance through complementary forces: expansion and contraction, action and rest, giving and receiving, individuality and togetherness. Relationships often reflect the same kind of dance. The problem isn't the differences themselves. The problem is when those differences become rigid and unconscious and fear-driven, like when an anxious partner begins chasing from fear, or when an avoidant partner begins distancing from fear, right? That's when the cycle becomes painful and problematic. But when both people become aware of their patterns, something really beautiful can happen. Right? The anxious partner often brings that emotional awareness and vulnerability and a desire for connection. And the avoidant partner often brings that sense of independence and perspective and self-sufficiency and the ability to remain grounded during emotional intensity. And given the right level of self-awareness, communication, accountability, and emotional maturity, which is very important, these differences can actually complement one another. Right? The anxious partner can help the avoidant partner open their heart a little bit more. The avoidant partner can help the anxious partner develop a greater, sense of self-trust and autonomy. One learns how to move towards connection, and the other learns how to feel secure even when connection isn't immediately available. Right? So both people grow, both people expand, both people become more balanced. I think this is one of the reasons these dynamics are so common, to be honest, not because we're destined to suffer, but because relationships often bring us face to face with the very lessons we're here to learn. The anxious partner may be learning trust. The avoidant partner may be learning vulnerability. And together, they're being invited towards greater security. Now, does that mean every anxious and avoidant relationship should stay together? Of course not. Right? Some relationships are indeed unhealthy. Some people are just unwilling to grow and take accountability and make an effort. Some people refuse, and no amount of attachment theory can compensate for that. But I do think we've become too quick to label certain pairings as doomed, right? Sometimes what looks like incompatibility is actually just two nervous systems speaking different languages. And when both people become committed to understanding themselves and each other, those differences can become strengths rather than liabilities. Because secure relationships aren't built by finding someone exactly like you. They're built by learning how to love someone who is different from you while staying connected to yourself. And that's a very different conversation than the one most people are having online today. So remember, the strongest relationships aren't built by two perfect people. It doesn't exist. They're built by two people who are willing to recognize their patterns and work through them together. Which is why I don't believe anxious and avoidant relationships are automatically doomed. Can they be difficult? Absolutely. We know this. Can they become unhealthy? Yes, but difficulty alone is not evidence that a relationship should end, right? Sometimes the challenge is the invitation to communicate, the invitation to set healthy boundaries, the invitation to become more secure, the invitation to heal. And what matters most is whether both people are willing to participate in that process. Because if one person is doing all the work and the other refuses to acknowledge their patterns, it's a very different situation. Right? But when two people are committed to growth, when they acknowledge their triggers, when they can repair after conflict, right? When two people are willing to look inward rather than simply blame the other, That's where healing happens. That's where transformation happens. And in my opinion, that's one of the most beautiful things relationships can offer us. So if you're currently in an anxious avoidant dynamic, I want you to remember this. Your attachment styles are not your destiny. Your patterns are not permanent, and challenge does not automatically mean incompatibility. Sometimes the path of least resistance isn't the best choice. Sometimes the relationship that asks you to grow is the one that helps you become the healthiest version of yourself. And to me, that's the purest form of relational healing. If you're ready to take the next step, book a free consultation to explore how attachment coaching can help you become your most secure self. And as always, keep asking yourself, what would secure me do?